Hello and welcome to Sharing the Light, and I'm Reverend Robert Griffin. Sharing the Light is an online ministry outreach of the Sunshine Cathedral located at Fort Lauderdale, Florida. So, Pastor, what is your response to, is the Bible the Word of God?
Well, there's not really just one answer to that, is there? If the Bible is a collection of stories about God, or about people's experience of God, or what they think about God, or their search for God, well, then certainly it's a good thing to call it the Word of God. That's a perfectly fine euphemism. If by Word of God, though, a person means that maybe God dictated the Bible, it dictated every word, that God sort of gave dictation and some prophet or group of prophets just wrote it all down without any errors, then that's something that not everyone will agree with. We need to distinguish the Word of God from words of God. The language is sort of our invention. That's part of our human evolution. And so to think that God sort of sat down at a PC and typed up in language that we would use is sort of a naive idea, I think. In the Bible, the Word of God is the spoken word of the prophets. So people who are sort of God-filled, God-inspired, they speak for God. They speak to the people on behalf of God, challenging them, comforting them, in times of defeat, sort of trying to rally them. If they've sort of slipped from their moral center, trying to call them back. And so when the prophet speaks, the prophet is speaking for God, and the prophet's word is considered the Word of God. In the Psalms, which is sort of a hymnal or a prayer book, which we find in our Bible, those writings are the word to God. They're prayers, they're songs to God. And so those clearly aren't words from God, they're words to God. That's what they're meant to be. And then in the New Testament, in the fourth gospel, in the Gospel of John, that writer thinks that Jesus is the Word of God, that He is the Word made flesh. And so in what we're calling the Word of God can be several different things. It can be the spoken word of the prophets. There is the word to God in the Psalms, and then there's the Word made flesh in the person of Jesus. So to call the Bible the Word of God isn't really a biblical concept, because in the Bible the Word of God is several different things. Some people, sort of in the New Age movement, believe in channeling, where, say, I just go into a trance and some spirit speaks through me, maybe some dead ancestor or something. But that's really not a Christian belief. Christians don't normally believe in channeling, and yet a lot of people act as if that's how they think the Bible came to be, as if someone just channeled the Bible. But the people who wrote what later got into the Bible, and remember the church tells us what the Bible is. The Bible doesn't tell us what the church is. The church doesn't spring out of the Bible. The Bible springs out of the church. The church compiled books and scrolls and stories that were floating around and said, these are the stories we're going to put together in one book and call our Bible. And so it was much more of an evolutionary process. Culture was involved, individual personalities were involved, psychology, human choices, all of that is involved in a way that channeling doesn't allow. And so the Book of Mormon's story is that the angel Moroni came and just sort of gave Joseph Smith all the words. But that's not the Bible story. The Quran story is that the angel Gabriel came and just gave Muhammad all the words. But that's not the Bible story. The Bible story is this person writes to his community, someone else writes to his community, someone writes to his community. The church later gathers all these things together and collects them into a library of books that we call the Bible. And so...
and that was officially done with the council.
The church decided to adopt the Hebrew canon and then add what we now call the New Testament, and that was done in ecumenical councils where people sat around a table and argued, about what would go in and what would go out. Some communities only wanted the Gospel of Luke. Some communities wanted sayings gospels, where it's just nothing, no story. Just Jesus said this, Jesus said this, Jesus said this. The gospels that won are the four we have, and they are all narratives. The gospels that tell a story. Jesus starts out in Mark with his baptism and his ministry, and Matthew and Luke starts out with his conception. But it goes from there all the way to crucifixion and resurrection. So the Gospels that won out were ones that told a story. But there were other Gospels, and communities were using them. But these are the ones that made it in. So the Word of God isn't the words of God. And that's, I think that's what we need to remember. There's one more distinction I want to make too, is there's a difference between the prescriptive word and the descriptive word. There's a lot of stuff in the Bible that we find frankly offensive. We find in the Bible the words, slaves obey your masters. Well, ethically, that's obviously a flawed teaching. Women stay silent in church. Well, that's probably a culturally based thing. There was some reason why women in a particular culture were told to do that. And so we may not agree with some of those things that are in that. But it's in the Bible, and the Bible is sacred to us. But those are descriptive words. Those are the words describing how things were. When the book of Joshua tells us that Joshua makes the sun stand still, well, we know that the sun doesn't travel through the sky. So that's describing how they viewed cosmology. They thought the sun traveled, and so if it felt like time stood still, that must mean that someone made the sun stand still. That's describing what they believed at the time or what their experience was at the time. That's the descriptive word. There's also the prescriptive word, prescribing what ought to be. When Jesus says, love your enemies, pray for those who curse you, love your neighbors as yourself, don't judge, those are prescriptions of how we ought to live. And so when we're reading the Bible, we need to be very careful to distinguish between the prescriptive and the descriptive words. Some things are simply describing how things used to be, and other parts are prescribing how things ought to be. And so we have to use some judgment when we're reading that. If we're willing to distinguish the prescriptive word from the descriptive word, and if we are willing to distinguish the Word of God, the message about God, from words from God, if we're willing to make those distinctions, I think it's perfectly fine to euphemistically call the Bible the Word of God. But we have to do that sort of work, I think, to make it make sense.
So in that same vein, the Bible as we know it today has been used to condemn a lot of things in society. For example, homosexuality. So what is one thing that you feel that the Bible has to offer to the gay and lesbian community that the Bible itself was once used to condemn the gay community?
In the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, we find that in Exodus, we find it in Deuteronomy, Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. In the Decalogue, there is a commandment to not use God's name in vain. And I think whenever someone uses what they're calling the Word of God to condemn people, they're using God's name in vain. And so people have used God's name in vain over the centuries, saying that my prejudice must be shared by God. And so they have used the Bible to condemn gays and lesbians, to condemn people of various religions, to promote, to defend child abuse or slavery or segregation or all kinds of terrible things. And so when they've done that, I think they have been using God's name in vain. The good news is that eventually people rethink that. And now slavery is universally recognized as evil, and children now have rights, and we advocate for them, and we have women clergy, and so things that were once used, the Bible was once used to cause harm, we simply sort of grew up and challenged those things and thought about them differently. In the African American history of this country, in the African American tradition, in the 19th century, African Americans showed us how we could use the Bible to challenge the very things the Bible had been used to hurt people with. People who promoted the practice of slavery would quote the Bible saying, "Slaves, obey your masters." But the people who felt enslaved, or who were enslaved, embraced the Exodus story, where slaves are liberated, where God inspires slaves to escape into freedom and to find a new life of liberation. And so people who have been oppressed by the Bible have come to find the Bible as a tool that they can actually fight that oppression and find their own liberation. So I think that's what we can offer gays and lesbians and anyone who's been wounded by the Bible, is that Yes, there are isolated passages that have been used as a weapon, but there are other messages that we can embrace and use for our own healing and our own liberation. Women have done it. People of color have done it. It's certainly time, I think, for gays and lesbians to do it.
Right.